Thank you for joining today's virtual workshop, where we want to focus on agility and flexibility in the workplace, which has so often been a barrier to both women and to men. We're all having to become more adept at holding meetings online. While it's always more preferable to meet face to face, the current pandemic unfortunately makes that impossible today. We nevertheless hope that this session will be thought-provoking and something that will spur you into action by the end of it. My name is Karen Brooks. I am the Executive Director for People and Infrastructure, responsible for HR, resourcing, learning and development, but also for business systems, cyber and information security, and also property and facilities management within Sir Robert McAlpine. I've been here for just over 3.5 years, and my career, unfortunately now, showing my age, spans some 35 years across lots of different sectors and industries. Michael.
Hello there, Michael Divers. I'm the People Director, Sir Robert McAlpine. Really proud to have been here some 3 years. My background is from HR and in consultancy over a time span much longer than yours, Karen. And I got to tell you, you were right about I shouldn't have used that photograph. In terms of the session today, and can I just say I wasn't looking for sympathy with that last comment. In terms of our session today, we want this, despite this medium, to be as interactive as it possibly can be. When we look back at this year, so much has happened to every single one of us. And it's important that we take time out to take stock and reflect on those journeys and what's important to us, especially in respect of our careers and how that fits in with our families, our lives, in a world that's been dramatically changing and will continue to change in the future. What do these insights mean? What do they mean to me and to my family and to my loved ones? But most importantly, having taken stock, what action do we intend to take?
When we last met at last year's Women in Construction conference, none of us could have imagined how this past year would have played out. While the world remains uncertain, the one thing that is undisputable is that the argument for agile and flexible working has largely been won. Or has it? What we now need to do is to focus on practically how do we make it work in a way that is right for the individual, recognising that everyone's circumstances and needs are different, and assists organisations to survive through this current climate and to get them in the right place to drive both performance and profitability. Today, we want to drill down to 4 specific areas: our relationships, the environment within which we work, the impact on performance, and most importantly, on our well-being, both as individuals and organisations. Like every other organisation, we at Sir Robert McAlpine have found this past year incredibly challenging, possibly the most challenging in our proud 150+ year history. And like every other organisation, we've had to make really difficult decisions through lockdown, and as we look to navigate out of it, ensuring that we have a viable business going forward. We're a family business, and family values therefore sit at the heart of everything that we do and who we are. When we make tough decisions, these need to be rooted in our values, otherwise they actually stand for nothing. In many ways, these moments are moments of truth, and people, i.e. employees, stakeholders, customers, partners, and suppliers have long memories. We have had to make some really tough calls, most notably around whether or not to furlough staff, and recently announced restructure, which sadly will see a number of colleagues actually leave our business. I would hope that no matter who you speak to, that they would express the view that while not necessarily agreeing with the decisions that were taken, that what we've done them in the right way and in line with our values. Throughout this year, we've continued to listen to people and their concerns through our engagement platform, SRM Pulse. We've also preserved our family first policies, albeit we have had to make some minor changes as to how these are delivered in the interim. Out of necessity, we've embraced agile and flexible working where this can be done. This has been a resounding success. Since last year, we've had 2 women on our board, myself and Alison Cox, the Exec Director for Engineering and Technical Services. And 3 of us are now on the executive leadership team, which includes a lady called Linda Thwaite, who's our Group Marketing and Communications Director. We've also supported FlexPo, an event that promotes agile and flexible working. And through them, we've sponsored research into this so that we can properly evaluate the business case. And actually, this research is published next week, which we're all excited about. We've commissioned the creation of a bespoke psychometric tool to assess culture fit within Sir Robert McAlpine. And importantly, we've been taking a much tougher stand in respect of breaches of policy in respect of inclusion. We now have a clear line beyond which we will not tolerate unacceptable behaviour within our business from anyone at any level.
For the eagle-eyed among you, you'll see Karen won the battle of the clicker. In terms of making it work, we said at the beginning that we would like this session to be as practical as possible. And we're going to be looking at 4 specific areas from now through the end of the session. The first is to do with relationships, the relationships at work and how those are having to, in many cases, be reinvented. This new environment that we are working in, the issue of performance and the challenges for measuring that and measuring contribution. And finally, dealing, and probably most importantly, the whole agenda of well-being. In respect of relationships, while working virtually offers many advantages, there are clearly disadvantages to this. I'm just thinking, a year ago, Karen and I were in a room with 50 of you, having a fantastic discussion about a number of issues, and we could feel and sense the room. We can't do that today. And arguably, that is one of the biggest downside to this new world. This is particularly true where colleagues are working in teams or where new colleagues join a team. No longer can we undertake the normal rituals that we're used to build trust and to nurture those relationships, playing to each other's strengths and supporting each other's development. So these need, in many ways, to be reinvented in a way that works for every single one of us. And that's a huge challenge that just cannot be underestimated. Karen and I had the unenviable task earlier this year of placing a large number of colleagues on furlough leave right at the beginning of the pandemic. And we did so via team calls. We thought it was important to speak to people directly. This was the first time we had ever had to do this. And while it was helpful to receive comments and feedback throughout the call, we really missed being able to sense how people were feeling in the room, and to understand the true impact of what we were saying and doing. In this new world, sensing and feeling how colleagues are is even more important than it was previously. Working virtually has also created new political dynamics, and I'm sure many of you know what I'm talking about, that we need to work around.
From an environment perspective, when we have to go to the office or to site, our environments have to be safe first and foremost. And our people need to work in a way that is compliant with a zero tolerance to non-compliance, as this can have, as you can imagine, a huge impact on everyone and on the project. With changing guidance, we need to continually keep this under review so that people are clear what is expected of them. The one thing that is becoming evident to me is that there is a risk of creating two cultures within our organisations, one for those who are site or operationally based, and for whom agile and flexible working is perhaps perceived as being more difficult and in those roles, and then mainly support roles for whom agile and flexible working is perceived as much easier. The nature of our offices, both central and site-based, now need to be compliant and ensure that those who have to go to the office or to site can do so safely. Most organisations are actually reviewing their office footprint, both in terms of the current demand, but also thinking about future ways of working. You know, what the demand will be, what size the footprint, does it need to be more collaborative, so less individual workspaces, greater spaces for collaboration. And actually, you know, this is clearly a defining moment for us as organisations in terms of making those decisions. The resounding feedback we're receiving from those who are working agilely and flexibly from home are that the boundaries are at best blurring or at worst are non-existent. So this poses a new management challenge and one that we need to get right in meeting our duty of care. Finally, our people need to have the right tools to be able to work remotely. Personally, I've been astounded by how well my colleagues in IT have been able to quickly support their colleagues working from home at the beginning of lockdown, ensuring that our people had what they needed, our systems were secure, and that there were no interruptions of service delivery to our clients.
The next area we're going to talk about is performance. It's been a key challenge for all of us, and particularly for people in HR like Karen and myself. And in many ways, we're having to think again about how we manage individual performance and contribution. This now needs to be much more focused on output rather than input, with evidence to demonstrate this. In many ways, even the term performance management may become redundant, as many of these processes focus on the input rather than the output, and not necessarily on the quality of the conversation. As we see our people less face-to-face, it's vital we take every opportunity to build engagement and trust, keeping our people aligned to constantly changing and evolving objectives. The bottom line is that people work for people, and I think that's truer now than ever before. So how you manage performance ultimately is a measure, it's a test of everything else you do in relation to your people agenda. And every road leads to that conversation. If it's not working, nothing else is working. Probably most importantly, from a commercial perspective, the role of the customer becomes increasingly more important, as we need to work even harder to develop those relationships, ensuring that we retain their confidence and support.
And finally, but not least, our duty of care in respect of everyone we employ needs to be re-evaluated, recognising that this will change from person to person and one size certainly does not fit all. We also need to recognise that not everyone is ideally suited to coping in this new world we're moving into. Therefore, our support structures and mechanisms need to be reviewed to ensure they're fit for purpose. Working in isolation, distance from your team, creates a whole new world of pressures and anxieties, and colleagues may not be comfortable in openly speaking out about their concerns. The one thing I find hugely interesting in these recent months is the glimpses into colleagues' homes to see their internal decor and fleeting glimpses of children running past or Amazon deliveries turning up in the middle of a conference call. This has reminded me so much that our people have lives outside of work and have loved ones that actually depend upon them. Therefore, the need to ensure we support our people's families and loved ones is even more prevalent than it was before. It's much more upfront and central than I think it ever has been. One thing I'm hugely proud of in SRM is the work that we've done on supporting our people financially through our support fund through this pandemic, where people have been struggling in financial hardship. And we've been able to offer grants and interest-free loans to those who were experiencing problems and difficulties. So what does this all mean culturally? As we've said before, this new world is actually very different from where we've come from. And while the challenges of construction are unique, I would argue that the same principles apply when working agile and flexibly, actually in any sector. We need to avoid a them and us culture where site or operational based people are treated less favourably than those in support roles, for whom working agile and flexibly is so much easier, whether that's perception or actual reality. We can get there by design through an agreed strategy and a plan, or actually by default as a result of events, I think, as the last few months have shown us. Either way, it doesn't really matter as long as we actually get there. The key thing for me is that we actually seize the moment. And in SRM, this is something that we are doing and intend to continue to do.
So, a question. What has changed for you in this past year? So up until now, we've spoken generally about the subject of agility and flexibility in the workplace. And some of this, or all of it, hopefully, will have resonated with your experiences. What we would like you to do now is to take a couple of minutes self-reflection to note down what has changed for you in this past year, and to think about this in terms of these four headings. Your relationships, the environment within which you work, how this has all impacted upon your performance, and then finally, the impact on your well-being and the well-being of your family and loved ones. So if you could just take a couple of moments to reflect and perhaps note some thoughts down under those four headings. Okay. Many of you will have been aware of the recent death of Ruth Bader Ginsburg, who was an Associate Justice of the US Supreme Court. She's someone who I've become absolutely fixated on in her life recently. And if you're not aware of her, I would urge you to source information on her. She was widely recognised as being a trailblazer who fought for gender equality as a lawyer, and she became a beloved hero of the progressive movement in the US and beyond. When she was confirmed to the Supreme Court and appointed by Bill Clinton in 1993, RBG, as she became known, was a reserved, relatively unknown Court of Appeals judge. But during the course of her 27 years, remarkably, on the Supreme Court, she became an improbable pop culture icon, inspiring everything from an Oscar-nominated documentary film called RBG to her own action figure. We would now like to play you a short clip on her remarkable life and achievements.
Ruth Bader Ginsburg, the notorious RBG, a pop culture icon. A complicated figure, a Supreme Court justice who became an unlikely celebrity.
I am nearly 84 years old and everyone wants to take a picture with me.
A woman criticized for being politically divisive.
Recent comments by Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg about Donald Trump have even some of her supporters wondering if she went too far.
But whose best friend on the bench was her ideological opposite, Antonin Scalia.
You know, what's not to like? Except her views of the law, of course.
Some liberals wanted her to step down under Obama to give him a chance to appoint another justice. But it wasn't in her character.
I want to see what your workout is.
Let's go.
There's even a Hollywood movie about her early experiences fighting for women's rights.
It is a cage, and these laws are the bars.
Ginsburg proved instrumental in breaking down piece by piece a rigid framework of gender discrimination woven deep within American law. And of all things, cases dealing with money became a central tool in her arsenal. From government benefits to pay discrimination and the simple right of being considered fit to take over a deceased family member's estate, Ginsburg often focused on economic gaps to make the case for equal rights.
So much had been made of differences between the two sexes that she had to expose how customary thinking about what was men's jobs, women's jobs, and responsibilities discriminated against individuals.
In 1971, Ginsburg was a law professor working with the ACLU. At the time, many banks still denied women credit cards unless they had a male cosigner. Only 43% of women participated in the labor force, and those who did participate made on average 40% less than men. Ginsburg's work helped change that. Her first major Supreme Court victory came in 1971, in a case called Reed versus Reed. In the case, a separated married couple from Idaho had been fighting over control of their deceased son's estate. The mother and father, Sally and Cecil Reed, both applied to be administrator of the estate. But Idaho named the father because the legal code explicitly read males must be preferred to females. The mother's lawyer argued the state's law was unconstitutional because it violated the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment of the Constitution. Ginsburg was looking for a gender discrimination case making an equal protection argument like this, because that was the same argument Thurgood Marshall had used to secure his string of civil rights victories from the court. So Ginsburg and the ACLU began helping the wife's legal team, writing a brief for the case's Supreme Court hearing that sealed the deal for a historic ruling. The total value of the estate? No more than $1,000.
She was conscious of having to move slowly from larger to larger sums because, of course, the opposition always argued, well, in effect, this is expensive, if you apply gender equity. So she was very conscious of the money involved.
But the dispute over that small estate changed legal history in the United States forever. The court's 7 male justices sided unanimously with the wife, setting a major precedent that the Equal Protection Clause applied to women's rights and prompting legislatures to revise hundreds of state and federal laws. It's since been cited in no less than 56 subsequent Supreme Court decisions, from cases expanding abortion rights to ending male-only admission and rooting out gender discrimination in pension payments. Her next major case, Frontiero versus Richardson. This new case centered around a woman serving in the military denied the same benefits given to a male serviceman despite the fact that they served alongside one another. This woman was an Air Force lieutenant named Sharon Frontiero. Frontiero was married but realized one day that she wasn't getting a housing allowance like her married male counterparts. When she brought it up to the Air Force, she was told she was ineligible because her husband didn't depend on her for more than 1/2 of his income, a requirement not levied on Air Force wives.
I ask no favor for my sex. All I ask of our brethren is that they take their feet off our necks.
The verdict? Another victory for Ginsburg. As Ginsburg continued to build out her various legal challenges, she embarked on a savvy judicial strategy of also showcasing men harmed by gender discrimination. Although that strategy earned her criticism from some women's rights activists.
We'll hear arguments next in 73-1892, Weinberger against Weisenfeld.
The case's plaintiff was Stephen Weisenfeld. Stephen's wife Paula was the primary breadwinner in their family. She worked as a teacher and regularly paid into Social Security. But after Paula tragically died during childbirth, Stephen sought Social Security payments to help him stay at home and raise their surviving child, benefits that would routinely have been granted to a married mother in the event of a father's death. But Stephen was denied Social Security and ended up taking his grievance to the court with Ginsburg's help. In her argument, Ginsburg drew attention not only to this widower harmed by the law, but also to how that law demeaned the worth of his late wife's work. The strategy paid off in court. Ginsburg secured another unanimous ruling from an all-male panel of justices.
The point she was making in some of these Social Security cases, that you could not discount the fact that the wife had always worked. And you could not discount her labor and her earnings. It counted. It was essential in many households.
From behind the bench, Ginsburg also made her mark on the fight against gender discrimination. This time, it came down to a woman's right to a paycheck. In a case called Ledbetter versus Goodyear Tire and Rubber Company, she wrote one of her most famous dissents. The pay discrimination case pitted an Arkansas woman named Lily Ledbetter against the massive Goodyear company. After working at Goodyear for 19 years, Ledbetter had found out from an anonymous note that she was making hundreds less every month than even the lowest paid man in her position. She sued Goodyear for sex-based pay discrimination under the Civil Rights Act and won. But then her case got tangled up over a question of whether the statute of limitations had lapsed. In a split decision, the court ruled in Goodyear's favor. But to Ginsburg, this decision was deeply flawed. In a stinging dissent, she outlined how the court's decision overlooked some of the most common characteristics of pay discrimination, like the fact that it often occurs in small increments and remains hidden. She concluded, "The ball is in Congress's court to fix the problem." Soon after, Congress acted on Ginsburg's challenge, passing the Lilly Ledbetter Act in 2009 and extending the statute of limitations.
I signed this bill for my daughters and all those who will come after us, because I want them to grow up in a nation that values their contributions.
From Ledbetter versus Goodyear, all the way back to her first Supreme Court brief, Ginsburg's knack for zeroing in on issues surrounding money changed legal history in the United States forever.
Okay, so what were the lessons that we can learn from Ruth Bader Ginsburg? Fight for the things you actually care about, but actually do it in a way that will lead others to join you. So think about, how do you collaborate more? How do you get people to go along with you on the journey and fighting the cause? Women belong in all places. We all know that, where decisions are actually being made. It shouldn't be that women are the exception. And the third point for me, this quote that was often used by Ruth Bader Ginsburg, it's actually extracted from a letter by an activist and feminist, Sarah Grimke, in July 1837. And the actual quotation was, "I ask no favours for my sex. I surrender not our claim to equality. All I ask of our brethren is that they will take their feet from off our necks and permit us to stand upright on the ground which God designed us to occupy." And RBG was famous for not saying a lot, but actually what she said had real impact. And finally, generally change in our society is incremental. Real change, enduring change actually happens one step at a time, as I think one of her first cases showed us, where the fight was over an estate of $1,000. And was that, the male or the female best place to do that? So how does this actually translate today? If we were to apply these themes today, and actually where we are just now, I think the focus should be on what we really care about. The things that we're passionate about and will actually bring others along with us. If anything this past year has shown us, it's what is really important in our lives. There are, I'm sure, just 2 or 3 things. Women need to be in places where decisions are made, full stop. Not because we're women, but actually because we deserve to be there and we have value to add, we have a contribution to make. Once we're there, it's our obligation to make a real difference, to be able to visibly demonstrate that value and contribution. And the final lesson for me is around the power of steady, incremental progress rather than a big bang revolution. Recognizing that the progress that we've made and incrementally building on that one step at a time.
Okay. Hopefully you've all been inspired as Karen and I have been by what we've been looking into regarding RBG. And we would now like to split you into 4 groups, each group focusing on one of the 4 headings above. We believe that there have been and that there continues to be inherent barriers to agile and flexible working, which in turn have presented barriers to the advancement of women in the workplace. We now have an opportunity to break through some of those barriers to ensure that the progress that's been made in these past months can be built upon. So in the first group, group number 1, we would like you to consider the issue of relationships. In the second group, consider the environment in which you work. In the third group, consider performance. And in the fourth group, consider the issue of well-being. Within those groups, subject to technology working, which I'm sure it will, you'll have 20 minutes to have a discussion. And what I would ask you to do is to identify a spokesperson for each group and to come up with 3 actions that you could commit to under that heading. So you will now be invited to join either rooms 1, 2, 3, or 4.
Let's go to 1.
Put them all in one room. Come off silent. I think you're all on mute. Lois, I can see you.
Oh, hi, I don't know.
Hello, Lois. Hello, Lois. Lois, you're on our screen. How fantastic. Guys, can you all come off mute? We've got a problem. What we're going to do is we're going to pull you together as one group, and we're going to look at the 4 topics that I talked about. Guys, can the rest of you come off mute?
There's 12. You need to click the blue arrow.
Right. Okay. Just 1 minute more. Right.
Just talk it through.
Guys, who else is able to speak at the moment? Because at the moment, it's Lois and myself. As much as I'm looking forward to having a conversation with my new best friend Lois, it'd be great if some of the rest of you could join the conversation.
What we were going to do was to move into breakout rooms, but for whatever reason that doesn't seem possible. So probably best to have an open debate between Michael and myself and all of you that are on the call.
Right. Okay, shall we start? What in terms of relationships, did any of what we've discussed resonate with you about this new world we're living in? What do you think, Lois? Lois, I'm going to be picking on you now because nobody else is talking to me.
Do you think that's relationships with colleagues or?
I think it's relationships. Yeah, it's relationships at work.
Yeah. It's an interesting one, isn't it? I think I'm an urban designer, so I'm in the construction industry, and I think it's definitely been interesting to see the difference between men and women. The practice that we're kind of pioneering women in architecture, but there has been a little bit of interest from the gents saying, you know, why hasn't this been done for us? So that's
in what respect, in terms of flexible and agile working?
So there's brought in mentoring, which has been offered to women, and then kind of there's a discussion of, well, why haven't the men been offered that before? And so the relationships sometimes can then become a bit fraught between some men and some women about equality. And I'm a believer that everyone should be treated equally. I don't think, you know, that the quote about, you know, men shouldn't stand on our necks. I thought that was really interesting, but I think we've got to be careful as women that we don't try and stand on the men's necks either. So I think it's a balance of equality and relationships.
I completely agree, Lois. I think it's a difficult balance to get sometimes, particularly in construction where women are so underrepresented in so many different of the roles within construction. And it's trying to ensure that you have that equality in terms of that everybody offered the same opportunities, whilst in fairness trying to give women a leg up in terms of trying to get into some of these jobs that have been impossibly difficult to get into. You know, it's not so long ago that, you know, you walked on a construction site, you know, and, you know, women were seen as an alien from outer space, you know, whatever job they might be doing. So yeah, I think it's a difficult one. And you talked about colleagues earlier. I think ultimately, you know, that can be line manager, you know, to their direct reports. I think the dynamic of that relationship's changed in terms of having to work virtually, you know, starting to think about, you know, trust, in my opinion, has always been critically important, but now more so than ever, in terms of with people working remotely, and you can't necessarily see what time someone comes onto site, what time they leave site if they're working from home, and actually it's got to be much more output focused, and you've got to be focused on that. So it's an interesting challenge, definitely.
Have you been working remotely through the pandemic, Lois?
I have, yes. It's been quite an adjustment for our practice. I think before it, there was a lot of people asking to work from home, and it, like you say about this trust issue, there was, you know, that element of risk. But I think we all rose to the challenge and proved that actually we can be efficient and profitable even working from our own homes. So now we have got the office is open, and you know, COVID guidelines are all in place and things like that. But we're finding in our master planning office in particular, we've still got people who are vulnerable, so you want to be sensitive to those. So you know, I've got children to pick up, things like that. So it's more convenient for me to work from home, and I actually find that I'm more productive at home as well, which is interesting. But I think it's that collaboration, it's the creativity in architecture, especially, that you have around a table together, that is then much trickier to do virtually.
I think that's really interesting, Lois, in terms of moving into the environment element. One of the things that, given my role on property and facilities management, we're looking at is how do you use that office footprint in future? And what does it look like? Do you need the same kind of square footage? And actually, if you do, how do you configure that? What does it look like? You know, are you moving to fewer desk spaces, less that are dedicated to individuals and more that are hot desking? And do you have more collaborative areas, you know, of different kinds where people can sit, as you quite rightly say, and collaborate and around, you know, work-related issues?
Yeah, I mean, it's not the same to look over a drawing with a mask on and you're sort of, you know, there's no very hard to eye contact and interact with each other. It is definitely having an impact on our environments. Like you say, we were 12 in master planning, and now only 6 people can be in there at one time. And now I'm finding when I do pop into the office, there's only 2 people there because people are working from home, and then that doesn't have the same environment either. You know, you're doing much more virtual conversations even on your computer. So I had my landline call when I was headphones in chatting to somebody online, but the receptionist didn't know that because, you know, so it's sort of become, you've got lots of phones. It's a different environment again. And I think, we have expanded. We have opened we've moved our London office to Somerset House, actually. So we've still kept 2 offices through this pandemic, making that decision as a practice to do that. Because, you know, we believe that they won't go back to normal, as it were, but hopefully there'll be a different new normal that will still mean that we can work together in an office environment. But like you say, how that looks, how that works.
We're all going to have to figure out, and I think on sites for us, for people who are on this call, I think is also very, very different in terms of, clearly there are certain jobs on a project site that you can't conduct 2 meters socially distancing, you know, so having to think about actually how you configure that task and activity, you know. So if you're doing fit out, you know, you can't actually carry a piece of plasterboard on your own, and you can't be 2 meters apart. So thinking about how you do that with masks on and do it as safely as you possibly can, you know, they're all things that we have suddenly had to, you know, think about and try and get as safer ways, you know, back-to-back working, side-to-side working, you know, masks, gloves, and, you know, and all the PPE protection. It is really interesting, and I can just see with the guidance changing, with the tier 1, tier 2, tier 3, you know, that we're bringing in, it'll just keep constantly evolving, and the guidance will change, and we'll have to change what we do.
Yeah, I think.
Sorry, Lois.
I was just going to say, I think somebody said to me within the time, there's been over 200 or just under 200 changes in political guidelines for the COVID time since March. Do you think that's quite incredible, really?
Totally. And I mean, I can think, you know, if I bring some of my outside hobby into this environment, I actually own and I'm chairman of a football club at quite a decent level. And, you know, the changes there that we've had to do, we're allowed fans in the stadium, has been incredible, you know, in order to keep going, because clearly it's a business, but it's very local community focused. And it's been an area from a well-being perspective that has been really important, I think, for the local community to get back up and running, because it gives people an outlet, you know. But you can't, you know, I've had to think about younger people, you know, generally aren't as good as keeping to the rule of 6 and the 2 meter social distancing. So having, you know, creating pens and wristbands where people have to stay, you know, in their social hubs, etc., and, you know, stewards to make sure that they comply with that, to keep everybody safe, you know, and serving people their drinks and their food at their place in the stadium while they're seated, all really important and completely alien to the world we were in March before this all happened. So nothing as constant as change.
I suppose the thing we were thinking about is smart organizations, things are never going to be the same, but what are they going to be? And smart organizations are going to be working with their people to create what that looks like, rather than dictating it, because we don't have the answers. No. So in terms of how do you reinvent relationship management? You talked about the power of people being together around an issue. And a lot of that's about, picking up non-verbal signals. How do you do that virtually? The whole thing about performance. I want to know I've done a good job. But my boss and I need to be on the same page about what that looks like. In terms of my well-being, how open am I to be really sharing how I'm feeling? In this crazy world. So I think smart organizations, as they look to learn from what's been happening this year, they're going to have to really work with their people to come up with some of the answers to these questions.
I think that's absolutely true, both from a relationship perspective, but also performance and well-being in terms of, as I said earlier on, one size doesn't fit all, and therefore as a line manager, I think the onus is going to be on them to be engaging each of their team and finding out what works for them, in terms of, where you have childcare responsibilities, whether you're a mum or a dad, the fact that you can fit your work and your outputs around discharging those responsibilities. Obviously, in my opinion, having been that person years ago, I think it means you're more engaged and you're more committed to that organisation that gives you that flexibility and allows you to work around that. And we have colleagues that do that now, and I think from a performance perspective, that the same is true in terms of, we will all have worked for individuals who are very input focused, and it's about presenteeism and and all of those things that relate to that. But ultimately, none of that really matters. If you can do what you need to do in a shorter space of time and jiggling that across a number of hours, does that really matter if you produce a quality output and deliver on the objectives that you've been set? I don't think it does, but it's what kinds of training do we need to do with our line managers and our leaders to help get them in the space that they are comfortable with that?
Yeah, I had a male colleague, we were having a chat on Skype the other day, and he was saying, sod's law, it was the one time he said, he took his son to the park and the dog for a walk, just to have a breather, that one of the directors phoned him and said he needed something urgently, and I think that's the tricky thing, isn't it? Sometimes, especially I find in architecture, is that everything's always needed yesterday. And so we're kind of constantly up against deadlines. So it's a tricky balance. And